I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into my childhood home and saw the framed photo on the mantelpiece. It wasn't the family portrait from our last Christmas together. It was a glossy corporate headshot of my sister Victoria accepting some leadership award, surrounded by executives in expensive suits. My own military commendation from my last deployment had been quietly moved to a side table, half hidden behind a decorative plant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 hours later, when my parents told me they were writing me out of their will. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because, in their words, leaders are born, not made, and you've never really shown the capacity to lead anyone important. They had no idea that in 6 months, I'd be leading the most critical humanitarian mission in recent history, a mission that would save thousands of lives and change everything they thought they knew about leadership. This is that story. The invitation came on cream-colored cardstock, the kind my mother only used for important occasions. Family dinner this Sunday, 6 p.m. sharp. We have exciting news to share. I remember staring at it in my small apartment kitchen, wondering what could possibly warrant such formality. Maybe Dad's law firm was expanding again. Maybe Victoria had landed another promotion at her Fortune 500 company. I drove the familiar 43 minutes from my apartment in Hartford to their house in Greenwich, Connecticut that Sunday evening. The November air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to turn that perfect New England gold. I'd always loved this drive. It gave me time to decompress from my work at the Veterans Administration, where I coordinated support services for returning soldiers struggling with PTSD and reintegration challenges. The house looked exactly the same as it had since my childhood. Pristine colonial architecture, manicured lawn, 3-car garage that housed Dad's BMW, Mom's Mercedes, and the vintage Porsche he never drove but couldn't bear to sell. Everything screamed success, stability, the American dream realized through decades of careful planning and strategic decisions. Victoria's Tesla was already in the driveway when I arrived, gleaming under the motion sensor lights. Of course she was early. Punctuality was just another way she demonstrated her superiority. I sat in my modest Honda Civic for a moment, gathering myself for what I knew would be a performance. Every family gathering was a performance now. Had been since I'd chosen my path instead of theirs. My mother, Patricia Wells Morrison, opened the front door before I even knocked. She was wearing what I'd come to think of as her entertaining outfit, a navy blazer that cost more than my monthly rent, pearls that had been her mother's, and that practiced smile she'd perfected during decades of law firm social events. "Sarah, darling, you made it," she said, though her eyes were already scanning my appearance with the subtle disapproval I'd grown accustomed to. My work clothes, khakis and a simple blouse, were clean and professional, but they weren't designer. They didn't announce success the way her outfit did. "Wouldn't miss it, Mom," I replied, stepping into the foyer that still smelled like the expensive candles she bought from that boutique in Manhattan. The scent always reminded me of trying too hard, of covering up something that needed to be hidden. Victoria emerged from the living room like she was making an entrance, which, knowing my sister, she probably was. At 32, she was 2 years older than me and had spent those extra years building what our parents considered the perfect life. MBA from Wharton, senior director position at a multinational consulting firm, marriage to Bradley, who worked in private equity and wore suits that cost more than some people's cars. "Sarah," she exclaimed, embracing me with the kind of hug that looked warm from the outside but felt calculated up close. "You look, well. How's the nonprofit world treating you?" The way she said nonprofit world made it sound like a hobby, something I did to pass time before getting serious about my life. I'd heard that tone from her for years now, ever since I'd left my MBA program to join the Army, then left the Army to work with veterans. Each decision had been met with the same barely concealed disappointment, the same suggestion that I was wasting my potential. "It's good," I said simply. "Meaningful work." "Of course it is," she replied, but her smile never reached her eyes. Dad appeared from his study, still wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that probably cost more than most people's formal wear. Richard Morrison had built his career on being formidable, in the courtroom, in negotiations, in every room he entered. At 65, he commanded respect through sheer presence, the kind of man who never had to raise his voice because people automatically listened when he spoke. "Sarah," he said, shaking my hand instead of hugging me. We'd stopped hugging years ago, sometime after I'd made it clear I wasn't following the path he'd laid out for me. "How's work?" "Good, Dad. We just launched a new program for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. I'm heading up a team of 12 counselors and—" "That's nice," he interrupted, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. In his world, leading 12 counselors at a VA office wasn't leadership, it was management. There was a difference, and he'd made sure I understood it. We moved to the dining room, where Mom had set the table with her good china. Another sign that this dinner was about more than catching up. The meal was perfect, as always. Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, wild rice pilaf. Everything coordinated, everything elegant, everything designed to impress. The conversation during dinner was carefully choreographed, the way it always was. Dad talked about his latest high-profile case, defending a pharmaceutical company against a class action lawsuit. Victoria shared news about her promotion to regional director, managing teams across 3 states, overseeing multi-million-dollar client relationships. Mom discussed her charity work, organizing galas, sitting on boards, the kind of philanthropy that involved writing checks and attending events rather than getting your hands dirty. I listened, contributed when expected, but felt increasingly like I was watching a play I'd seen too many times before. They talked about success in terms of money, influence, recognition. They measured leadership by the size of budgets controlled, the number of people managed, the prestigious clients served. When I mentioned that my veteran employment program had achieved a 93% job placement rate, the highest in the state, there was a brief moment of polite interest before the conversation moved on to Victoria's upcoming business trip to Singapore. It wasn't until Mom brought out dessert, her famous apple tart that she only made for special occasions, that I realized we'd reached the main event. "We ask you both here tonight because we have some important news to share," Dad began, setting down his coffee cup with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything. "Your mother and I have been doing some estate planning, making sure our affairs are in order." My stomach tightened. Estate planning conversations in our family had always been fraught with unspoken expectations and carefully maintained hierarchies. "We've decided to restructure our will," Mom continued, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when delivering news she knew might be poorly received. "We want to make sure our resources go where they can have the most impact, where they'll be used most effectively." Victoria was nodding along, clearly already privy to whatever was coming. I felt that familiar sensation of being on the outside of a conversation that had been happening without me. "We're leaving the house and the majority of our assets to Victoria," Dad said, each word delivered with the weight of a legal decision. "She's demonstrated the kind of leadership and business acumen that gives us confidence our legacy will be preserved and grown." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago not to show weakness in front of my family. "What about Sarah?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We're setting up a trust fund," Mom said quickly, as if this was generous. "Nothing extravagant, but enough to supplement your lifestyle. We know nonprofit work doesn't pay well, and we want to make sure you're comfortable." A trust fund. A safety net for their disappointing daughter, who'd chosen meaning over money, who'd never learned to lead anything important. "We just think Victoria has proven herself in ways that show real leadership potential," Dad continued, warming to his theme. "Managing large teams, navigating complex business relationships, driving results that matter on a significant scale. That's the kind of capability that builds generational wealth." "And what have I proven?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. There was a pause, the kind of uncomfortable silence that fills the space when everyone knows the truth, but no one wants to say it out loud. "You've proven that you care," Mom said finally, her voice gentle but devastating. "You have a good heart, Sarah. You've always been compassionate." But compassion isn't the same as leadership. Leadership requires vision, strategic thinking, the ability to make hard decisions that affect hundreds or thousands of people. You work with veterans, Victoria added, trying to sound supportive. That's important work. But it's not scalable. You're not building something that can grow, that can have broader impact. You're essentially providing counseling services. Counseling services that help people rebuild their lives, I said, feeling defensive despite myself. Of course, Dad said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in to diffuse the tension, and that's valuable work. But it's not leadership in the sense that creates lasting change. You've never run a large organization, never been responsible for major strategic decisions, never had to answer to shareholders or boards of directors. You've never had to fire anyone, Victoria added, or restructure departments, or navigate regulatory compliance, or manage budgets that affect hundreds of jobs. They were right, in their way. I'd never done those things. My world was smaller, more personal. I worked directly with veterans who were struggling, helped them find jobs, connected them with mental health resources, advocated for their needs within the VA bureaucracy. It was hands-on work, one-on-one relationships, individual success stories, rather than sweeping organizational achievements. The thing is, Sarah, Dad continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining complex legal concepts to clients, leadership isn't just about caring. It's about the ability to inspire and direct large groups of people toward common goals. It requires a certain presence, authority, the capacity to make difficult decisions quickly and live with the consequences. Some people are natural leaders, Mom added. They have that innate ability to command respect, to see the big picture, to think strategically about complex problems. Victoria has always had that quality, even as a child. She organized games, delegated responsibilities, made sure things got done. I remembered those childhood games differently. Victoria had been bossy, demanding, quick to exclude anyone who didn't follow her rules exactly. But apparently, those were leadership qualities I'd missed. You've always been more of a follower, Dad said, and the word hit me like a slap. There's nothing wrong with that. The world needs followers, dedicated, hardworking people who execute other people's visions. But leadership? That's different. That's rare. The conversation continued around me, but I'd stopped really hearing it. They talked about their decision as if it was based on objective criteria, as if they'd conducted some kind of scientific analysis of our respective capabilities. They spoke about leadership as if it was a measurable quantity, something that could be assessed and ranked like test scores or performance reviews. What they were really saying was that I'd never impressed them. I'd never done anything that met their definition of significant achievement. My work with veterans was nice, but it wasn't important. I was competent, but I wasn't exceptional. I was a good person, but I wasn't a leader. As we finished dessert and moved to the living room for coffee, I found myself studying the family photos arranged throughout the room. There was Victoria at her college graduation, Victoria at her wedding, Victoria receiving various awards and recognitions. There were family portraits from vacations and holidays, but increasingly, I noticed I appeared less frequently in the recent ones. It was as if I was slowly being edited out of the family story, becoming a supporting character in a narrative that was really about Victoria's ascent and my parents' success in raising a daughter who met their expectations. When I finally left that night, driving back to my small apartment with its second-hand furniture and stack of case files on the kitchen table, I felt something I'd never quite experienced before. It wasn't anger, exactly, and it wasn't sadness. It was a kind of crystallizing clarity. They thought I couldn't lead because I'd never led anything they considered important. They measured leadership by corporate hierarchies and financial metrics, and the kind of influence that got your name in business magazines. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't see, was that real leadership often happens in quiet moments, in one-on-one conversations, in the unglamorous work of helping people rebuild their lives one case at a time. But they were about to learn that lesson in a way none of us could have anticipated. Because 6 months later, when a massive earthquake devastated a remote region of Guatemala, and the State Department needed someone to lead an emergency humanitarian mission, they didn't call Victoria with her MBA and her corporate experience. They called me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks after that dinner, I was sitting in my cramped office at the Hartford VA building, staring at an email that would change everything. The subject line read, Application Status Update, International Development Leadership Fellowship. I'd been waiting for this response for 4 months. The fellowship was everything I'd been working toward, a chance to lead disaster relief operations internationally, combining my military background with my experience in veteran services. It was a prestigious program run jointly by the State Department and USAID, designed to identify and train the next generation of humanitarian leaders. Only 12 people were selected each year from hundreds of applicants. I'd spent 6 months crafting my application, late nights writing essays about crisis leadership, assembling a portfolio of my work with traumatized veterans, gathering recommendations from everyone, from my former commanding officer to the director of the Connecticut Department of Veterans Affairs. I'd even traveled to Washington twice for interviews, taking vacation days I couldn't really afford, and staying in a budget hotel near Union Station. My hands were trembling slightly as I opened the email. Dear Ms. Morrison, thank you for your interest in the International Development Leadership Fellowship. After careful consideration of your application and qualifications, we regret to inform you that we are unable to offer you a position in this year's cohort. I didn't need to read the rest. The familiar language of polite rejection washed over me like cold water. We were impressed by your background. Highly competitive pool. Encourage you to apply again in the future. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the water stain on the ceiling tile above my desk. This fellowship had been my shot at proving I could handle something bigger, something that mattered on a global scale. It was supposed to be my answer to every family dinner conversation about Victoria's latest promotion, every sideways glance when I mentioned my little veterans program. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in an office where I'd successfully helped over 200 veterans transition to civilian life, where I'd built programs that had become models for other VA offices across New England, and I couldn't even get accepted to a leadership development program. My computer chimed with another email. This one was from my colleague Marcus Rodriguez, who worked in our mental health services division. Coffee? You look like you could use it. Marcus had been watching me through the glass wall that separated our offices. He was one of the few people at work who knew how much this fellowship meant to me, partly because he'd been through his own share of rejections when he'd tried to transition from military service to civilian leadership roles. We walked to the small break room that served terrible coffee but provided a refuge from the constant stream of veterans seeking help, caseworkers juggling impossible caseloads, and administrators trying to stretch inadequate budgets to cover growing needs. Bad news? Marcus asked, though my expression had probably already answered his question. The fellowship didn't get it. I poured coffee that looked like it had been sitting in the pot since yesterday morning. I don't understand, Marcus. My application was solid. My experience is relevant. The interviews went well. Did they give you any feedback? I pulled out my phone and read the email more carefully. There was a paragraph I'd skipped over in my initial disappointment. While your experience in veteran services demonstrates admirable dedication to helping others, the selection committee felt that your background lacks the kind of large-scale operational leadership that our fellows typically demonstrate. We encourage candidates to gain experience managing complex, multi-stakeholder initiatives before reapplying. Marcus read over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. Large-scale operational leadership, what do they think you've been doing here? Apparently not the right kind of leadership. I sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs that had probably been there since the 1980s. Do you know what the worst part is? I keep hearing the same thing from everyone. My family, now this fellowship committee. I don't have the right kind of experience, the right kind of background, the right kind of presence. That's bullshit, Sarah. You've transformed this whole office. When you got here 3 years ago, our job placement rate was 38%. Now it's over 90%. You've trained staff in trauma-informed counseling, developed partnerships with dozens of local employers, created that mentorship program that pairs recent veterans with success stories. If that's not leadership, I don't know what is. I appreciated Marcus's support, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe everyone else was seeing something I couldn't. Maybe there was a difference between the kind of leadership I provided, personal, relationship-based, focused on individual outcomes, and the kind that actually moved mountains and changed systems. That afternoon, I did something I rarely allowed myself to do. I called in sick and went home early. My apartment felt smaller than usual as I sat on my second-hand couch, surrounded by the case files I'd brought home to review. Each file represented a veteran I was working with, someone whose life had been disrupted by military service, and who needed help finding their footing in civilian life. There was Jennifer Walsh, a former Army medic struggling with PTSD who'd been unemployed for 8 months before I helped her find a position with a local hospital. David Chen, a Marine veteran who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan and was now pursuing a nursing degree with support from our Education Assistance Program. Maria Santos, who'd been homeless for 6 months after her discharge before our housing initiative helped her get back on her feet. These weren't large-scale operations or multi-stakeholder initiatives. They were individual lives, one-on-one relationships, personal victories that happened in small offices and over coffee conversations, and through phone calls at odd hours when someone was having a crisis. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I was thinking too small, working too close to the ground to see the bigger picture that real leaders were supposed to see. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Heard about the fellowship. Sorry it didn't work out. There will be other opportunities. The casual tone of her message irritated me more than it should have. To her, this was just another minor setback in my ongoing series of minor achievements. She probably assumed I'd apply again next year, maybe take some leadership courses, gradually work my way up to the kind of background that impressive selection committees were looking for. What she didn't understand was that this rejection felt different. It felt final, like a door closing on the possibility that I could ever be the kind of leader people took seriously. I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd had with my former commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, when I was leaving the Army 5 years earlier. She'd tried to convince me to stay, to pursue a career in military intelligence where I could eventually lead large teams and manage complex operations. "Morrison," she'd said, "you have good instincts and people trust you, but if you want to lead at the highest levels, you need to start thinking bigger. Personal relationships are great, but they don't scale. Real leadership is about systems, strategies, influence that extends beyond the people you can personally touch." At the time, I'd thought she was wrong. I'd believed that the most important leadership happened in those personal moments, in the individual connections that helped people transform their lives. I'd chosen veteran services because I wanted to make a difference in a more direct, tangible way. But now, sitting in my quiet apartment with a rejection letter that essentially said I wasn't ready for serious leadership responsibilities, I wondered if Colonel Hayes had been right. Maybe I'd been hiding in the comfortable world of small-scale impact, avoiding the bigger challenges that real leaders were willing to tackle. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my parents. "Sarah!" Mom's voice was bright with surprise. "This is unexpected. How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm okay, Mom. I actually wanted to tell you about something. Remember that fellowship I mentioned a few months ago? The International Development Program?" "Oh yes, the one with the State Department. How did that go?" I didn't get it. The words came out more bluntly than I'd intended. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her calculating how to respond in a way that would be supportive without being patronizing. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry. Those programs are so competitive. I'm sure it has nothing to do with your qualifications." But I could hear something else in her voice. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of resigned confirmation of expectations. She wasn't shocked that I'd been rejected. On some level, she'd probably expected it. "They said I lacked large-scale operational leadership experience," I continued, not sure why I was torturing myself by having this conversation. "Well," she said carefully, "that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, you've done wonderful work with veterans, but that's a very specific, limited context. International development requires a different kind of skill set, managing multiple agencies, navigating political complexities, coordinating with foreign governments." Right, I said quietly. Maybe this is an opportunity to think about next steps, she continued, and I could tell she was warming to the subject. Have you considered going back to school, getting that MBA you started? Or maybe looking into positions with larger organizations where you could gain more diverse experience? Maybe, I said, though the thought of starting over, of admitting that my current path wasn't leading anywhere meaningful, felt overwhelming. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the different versions of leadership I'd encountered throughout my life. There was Victoria's version, commanding, strategic, focused on measurable outcomes and impressive titles. There was my parents' version, institutional, prestigious, recognized by external authorities, and validated by financial success. And then there was my version, personal, relationship-based, focused on individual transformation rather than systemic change. A version that apparently didn't count as real leadership in the eyes of fellowship committees, or family dinners, or career advancement opportunities. The next morning, I went back to work and threw myself into my cases with renewed intensity. If I was going to be stuck in small-scale leadership, I was going to be the best small-scale leader I could be. I stayed late, took on extra cases, developed new programs for veterans struggling with addiction and homelessness. But something had shifted. The work that had once felt meaningful now felt limited. Every success story was shadowed by the knowledge that I was helping individuals, while the larger systems that created their problems remained unchanged. Every program I developed was small, local, replicable perhaps, but not scalable in the way that impressed selection committees. I started researching other fellowship programs, other opportunities for international work, but they all seemed to require the same thing: evidence of large-scale leadership, experience managing complex operations, a track record of influence that extended beyond direct service. It was like being caught in a catch-22. I couldn't get the opportunities that would give me large-scale leadership experience because I didn't have large-scale leadership experience. 3 weeks later, I was working late again, reviewing applications for our expanded mentorship program, when I got a call that would change everything. The number was unfamiliar, with a Washington, D.C. area code. Sarah Morrison, this is Dr. Rebecca Chen from the State Department's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. I hope I'm not calling too late. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m. No, not at all. How can I help you? I'm calling because your name came up in a very unusual context, and I wanted to reach out directly. Are you familiar with the situation in Guatemala? The earthquake that hit the Western Highlands 2 days ago? I'd seen the news coverage, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake that had devastated a remote mountainous region where many of the residents were indigenous communities with limited access to emergency services. Yes, I've been following the reports. It looks devastating. It is. We're coordinating an emergency humanitarian response, but we have a problem. The affected area is extremely remote, accessible only by helicopter, and many of the survivors are former military or have military-adjacent experience. Veterans of Guatemala's civil conflict, former government soldiers, people with complex trauma histories who don't trust traditional aid organizations. I wasn't sure where this was going, but something in Dr. Chen's tone suggested this wasn't a routine information call. We need someone to lead an advanced team that can establish trust with these communities and coordinate the initial relief efforts. Someone with military background, experience working with trauma survivors, and the ability to operate effectively in austere conditions with limited resources. My heart started beating faster. Your name came up because one of your former colleagues, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, is now working with our Emergency Response Division. She recommended you specifically for this mission. Aye, what exactly would this involve? Leading a team of 12 specialists, medical personnel, logistics coordinators, communications experts, security officers. You'd be responsible for establishing our forward operating base, building relationships with local leaders, and coordinating the distribution of emergency supplies to approximately 3,000 displaced people. The scope of what she was describing was unlike anything I'd ever done. It was exactly the kind of large-scale, complex operation that fellowship committees and family dinners suggested I wasn't ready for. Dr. Chen, I said slowly, I should probably mention that I was recently rejected from the International Development Leadership Fellowship. The committee felt I lacked large-scale operational leadership experience. There was a pause, and then Dr. Chen laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. Ms. Morrison, with all due respect to fellowship committees, theoretical leadership experience isn't what we need right now. We need someone who can earn trust, solve problems with limited resources, and keep a team functional under extreme stress. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes says you have a talent for making impossible situations work. That's exactly what this mission requires. When would you need an answer? I need an answer now. The team flies out tomorrow morning. I looked around my small office, at the case files stacked on my desk, at the photos of veterans whose lives had been changed by our programs. This was my chance to prove that my kind of leadership, personal, relationship-based, focused on human connection, could work on a larger scale. I'll do it, I said. And just like that, everything changed. 18 hours later, I was standing on a military airfield outside Guatemala City, wearing borrowed cargo pants and a tactical vest that still smelled like the previous owner's bug spray. The morning air was thick with humidity and jet fuel, and the reality of what I'd committed to was hitting me in waves. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been right about one thing. This wasn't going to be anything like the theoretical leadership scenarios they discussed in fellowship applications. The advanced team I was supposed to lead was a collection of specialists who'd all done this kind of work before, in places like Haiti and the Philippines and Somalia. They had more field experience than I did, more technical expertise, and probably more reasons to doubt whether someone from a small VA office in Connecticut could handle coordinating a humanitarian crisis response. "You must be Morrison," said a voice behind me. I turned to see a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the kind of worn khaki pants that spoke of real field experience. "I'm Dr. Lisa Hamilton, medical team leader. I'll be running the health assessments and emergency treatment protocols." We shook hands, and I caught her sizing me up in the way experienced professionals do when they're trying to figure out if the new person is going to be competent or a liability. "First time leading international disaster response?" she asked, her tone neutral but probing. "First time," I admitted. "But not my first time working with trauma survivors in difficult conditions." She nodded thoughtfully. "Good. That's actually more important than people think. Half the challenge out there isn't logistics. It's getting people to trust you enough to accept help." Over the next hour, I met the rest of my team. There was Miguel Santos, our logistics coordinator, who'd spent 15 years managing supply chains in conflict zones. Captain James Wright, a former Army Ranger handling security and communications. Elena Vasquez, our cultural liaison who spoke fluent Quiché and had worked with indigenous communities throughout Central America. 8 other specialists, each bringing decades of experience to challenges I was only beginning to understand. The helicopter ride to the affected region took 2 hours, flying over landscapes that shifted from urban sprawl to volcanic peaks to remote valleys, where entire villages had been reduced to rubble. The pilot, a weathered Guatemalan named Carlos, pointed out landmarks through his headset. The epicenter of the earthquake, the main road that had been blocked by landslides, the temporary camps where survivors had gathered after their homes collapsed. "The communities up here," Carlos said, his English accented but precise. "They don't trust outsiders easily." During the Civil War, government aid workers were sometimes informants. Foreign organizations promised help that never came. They've learned to be careful. I pressed my face to the helicopter window, watching the terrain become more rugged and remote. Steep mountainsides covered in coffee plants gave way to rocky valleys, where small clusters of houses clung to impossible slopes. Many of the structures I could see had been damaged or destroyed. Roofs caved in, walls collapsed, entire sections of communities reduced to piles of concrete and corrugated metal. When we finally reached the designated landing zone, a barely flat stretch of ground that had been a soccer field before the earthquake split it with a massive crack, I got my first real look at the scope of what we were dealing with. Hundreds of people had gathered in what appeared to be a temporary camp, living in improvised shelters made from salvaged materials and emergency tarps. Children ran between the makeshift structures while adults sorted through piles of belongings that had been pulled from damaged homes. The air was filled with dust and the sound of voices calling out in languages I didn't recognize. "Remember," Elena said as we unloaded our equipment, Many of these people have never seen a helicopter that brought help instead of trouble. We need to move slowly, let them approach us. She was right. As our team set up our initial base camp, I could see people watching us from a distance. Curious but cautious, ready to retreat if we made any sudden moves. Some of the older men had the bearing I recognized from working with veterans, a particular kind of alertness that came from having survived violence. My first real test as a leader came within an hour of landing. We'd established a perimeter for our equipment and were beginning to assess the immediate needs of the camp when a commotion broke out near one of the temporary shelters. A woman was arguing loudly with two of our team members, Drive Hamilton and Miguel, while a crowd of community members gathered around them. "What's the situation?" I asked Elena as we approached. The woman, her name is Rosa, she's a community health worker. She's saying that Dr. Hamilton can't examine her daughter without permission from the village council. Dr. Hamilton is saying that the girl has symptoms of internal injuries and needs immediate medical attention. I could see the tension escalating. Dr. Hamilton was clearly frustrated. In her experience, medical emergencies took priority over cultural protocols. Rosa was standing protectively in front of a teenage girl who was pale and obviously in pain. The crowd was getting larger and more agitated. This was exactly the kind of situation that fellowship committees probably had in mind when they talked about complex multi-stakeholder leadership challenges. I had medical professionals who needed to do their jobs, community members who had legitimate reasons to distrust outsiders, and a potentially life-threatening situation that required immediate action. "Elena, can you ask Rosa if she'd be willing to talk with me privately for a moment?" I said. While Elena translated, I approached Rosa with my hands visible and empty, using the same body language I'd learned working with veterans who'd been triggered by authority figures. I kept my voice calm, and my movements slow. Elena facilitated a conversation that took place in a mixture of Spanish and Quiche, with Rosa occasionally glancing at her daughter and then back at me. After several minutes, Elena turned to me. She says the village council includes her husband, who was killed in the earthquake. She's afraid that if she allows foreign doctors to treat her daughter, other community members will say she's abandoning traditional ways. But she also knows her daughter is seriously hurt. I thought about all the times I'd worked with veterans who were caught between needing help and fearing the systems that provided it. The solution wasn't to override their concerns. It was to find a way to address the underlying issue. "Ask her if there are other community leaders here who could be part of the decision," I said. "People she trusts, people who could help her explain to others why she's choosing to accept medical help." This led to a longer conversation, with more community members joining the discussion. Eventually, an elderly woman who appeared to be a respected elder approached and spoke with Rosa for several minutes. Elena translated. The grandmother says that Rosa is now the senior woman in her family, which gives her the authority to make medical decisions for her children. She'll support Rosa's choice and explain it to anyone who questions it. Dr. Hamilton was able to examine the girl, who did indeed have internal injuries that required immediate treatment, while Rosa and the grandmother observed and asked questions about the procedures. Word spread through the camp that our medical team was willing to work with community protocols rather than ignoring them. By evening, we had a steady stream of people coming to our medical station, brought by family members who'd witnessed that first interaction and decided we could be trusted. "Nice work," Dr. Hamilton said as we debriefed around our camp stove that night. "I've seen too many operations fail because the leadership tried to impose medical protocols without considering cultural context. You found a way to respect both." But the real test was still coming. The next morning, Carlos radioed with urgent news. The main road connecting the affected region to Guatemala City had been cleared, which meant larger relief organizations would be arriving soon. The problem was that 3 different international NGOs were en route, each with their own protocols, their own distribution systems, and their own ideas about how aid should be delivered. "This is where it gets messy," Miguel explained as we watched the first convoy of trucks making their way up the mountain road. "Everyone wants to help, but if we don't coordinate properly, we'll have duplication of some services and gaps in others. Plus, the community will get overwhelmed trying to work with multiple organizations that all do things differently." I'd seen this kind of coordination challenge before, though never on this scale. At the VA, we regularly dealt with multiple agencies: federal veterans services, state programs, local nonprofits, private companies, all trying to help the same clients with different systems and requirements. The difference was that here, I was supposed to be the one coordinating everything. The first organization to arrive was International Relief Alliance, led by a man named Jonathan Keller, who had the kind of confident bearing that came from running large-scale operations. He stepped out of his vehicle wearing a crisp field vest with organizational patches and immediately began surveying the camp with the air of someone taking charge. "You must be the advanced team leader," he said, approaching me with a firm handshake. "Jonathan Keller, IRA Mission Director. We'll be taking over primary coordination from here. Your team did good work getting things started." There it was, the assumption that because his organization was larger and more established, they should naturally assume leadership. I'd encountered this dynamic before, though usually in conference rooms rather than disaster zones. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we'll be continuing to coordinate all relief efforts in this sector, State Department directive, but we'd like to discuss how IRA can integrate with the response framework we've established." Jonathan's expression shifted slightly. He clearly hadn't expected pushback from what he probably viewed as a temporary advance team. "I think there might be some confusion about command structure," he said. "IRA has been designated as the primary implementing partner for relief operations in this region. We have the mandate, the resources, and the experience to manage a response of this magnitude." I could feel my team watching this interaction, probably wondering if I was going to fold under pressure from a more experienced organization. This was the moment where my family's voices echoed in my head, the suggestions that I didn't have the presence or authority for real leadership, that I was better suited to following other people's directives. "Mr. Keller," I said, "I'm sure IRA has excellent capabilities. That's exactly why we want to coordinate effectively. The community leaders here have already established working relationships with our team. Rather than disrupting that trust, why don't we sit down and figure out how to leverage both of our strengths?" What followed was a 2-hour meeting under a makeshift tarp, with representatives from the 3 arriving organizations, key community leaders, and my team. It was messy, complicated, and full of competing priorities and organizational egos. But by the end of it, we had something that actually worked. A coordinated response plan that used IRA's logistics capabilities, Doctors Without Borders medical expertise, and Save the Children's education and family services, all coordinated through our advanced team's established relationships with community leaders. "You know," Elena said to me as we watched the first coordinated distribution of supplies that afternoon, "I've seen a lot of mission leaders over the years. Most of them try to solve problems by asserting authority. You solved that problem by creating collaboration." "Is that good or bad?" I asked. "It's rare," she said, "and it's effective." That evening, as our expanded team settled into what was becoming a well-functioning base camp, I called Dr. Chen to report on our progress. "The coordination is working well," I told her over the satellite phone. "We've got over 100 families receiving medical care, food distribution is happening on schedule, and the community leadership is actively engaged in planning." "Excellent," she said. "I'm getting very positive reports about your operation from multiple sources. How are you feeling about the leadership role?" I looked around at the camp, where my team members were working alongside IRA staff and community volunteers to prepare for the next day's operations. Children were playing between the tents while their parents attended a planning meeting run by Elena and one of the village elders. "Different than I expected," I said honestly, "but it's working." "Good," Dr. Chen said, "because we may need to extend your mission. There are reports of additional affected communities deeper in the mountains that haven't been reached yet. Are you ready for Phase 2? Phase 2. More communities, more complex logistics, more opportunities to prove that my kind of leadership could work on a scale that mattered." "Yes," I said, "we're ready." As I hung up the phone, I realized something had shifted in how I thought about leadership. It wasn't about commanding respect or managing large budgets or impressing selection committees. It was about creating conditions where people could do their best work in service of something larger than themselves. Maybe that had always been true. Maybe I just never had the chance to prove it until now. Phase 2 began with a problem nobody had anticipated. We'd been operating in the earthquake zone for 2 weeks when Elena came running to my tent at dawn, her usually calm demeanor replaced by something close to panic. "Sarah, we need to talk. Now." She was clutching a handheld radio and a piece of paper covered in hastily scribbled notes. "I've been monitoring emergency frequencies, and there's something happening that's not in any of the official reports." I followed her to our communications tent, where Captain Wright was hunched over multiple radio sets, switching between frequencies and recording transmissions. The expressions on both their faces told me this was serious. "What are you hearing?" I asked. Elena looked at her notes. "There's a village called Chajul, about 40 kilometers north of here, deep in the mountains. It wasn't on any of our target lists because officially, it was evacuated 3 days after the earthquake. But I'm picking up radio chatter in Quiche from people who say they're still there." "Evacuated to where?" I asked. "That's the problem," Captain Wright interjected. "According to government records, the entire population was relocated to refugee camps near the capital, but these radio transmissions suggest that at least some people never left, or maybe returned after the official evacuation." Elena pulled out a topographical map and pointed to a remote valley surrounded by steep ridges. "Chajul is here. The access road was completely destroyed in the earthquake. Landslides, bridge collapses, impassable. The only way in or out now is by helicopter, and the government says it's too dangerous to fly in that terrain." I studied the map, trying to understand why this was causing Elena such concern. "So there might be people in an isolated village that hasn't received any aid." "That's terrible, but why are you both looking like the world is ending?" Elena and Captain Wright exchanged glances. "Because," Elena said slowly, "the radio transmissions aren't just asking for help, they're reporting deaths. Multiple deaths, and the symptoms they're describing don't match earthquake injuries." My stomach dropped. "What kind of symptoms?" "Fever, respiratory distress, rapid onset. Sarah, I think they might be dealing with a disease outbreak on top of the earthquake damage. If that's true, and if the government doesn't know about it, we could be looking at a humanitarian catastrophe." Captain Wright pulled up another map on his laptop. "Here's the bigger problem. If there is an outbreak in Chajul, and if people from that village eventually make it to the refugee camps near Guatemala City, we could be looking at the spread of whatever disease this is to a population of over 50,000 displaced people." The implications hit me like a physical blow. An isolated village dealing with both earthquake damage and disease, no official recognition that they existed, no aid reaching them, and the potential for whatever was happening there to spread to much larger populations. "Have you reported this to the government coordination team?" I asked. "That's where it gets complicated," Captain Wright said. "I contacted our liaison at the National Emergency Commission. They insist that Chajul was completely evacuated, and that no one is living there. They're treating our radio intercepts as either false signals or refugees trying to return to an unsafe area." "What about flying in to confirm the situation?" Elena shook her head. "The government has declared the airspace around Chajul a no-fly zone due to unstable terrain and dangerous wind patterns. They say it's too risky for humanitarian flights." I felt that familiar sensation of being caught between bureaucratic systems and people who needed help. It was the same frustration I'd experienced at the VA when regulations prevented us from providing services that veterans desperately needed. Except now the stakes were potentially life and death for an entire community. "What do you think is really happening?" I asked. Elena chose her words carefully. "I think there are people in Chajul who never evacuated, or who returned to try to salvage what they could from their homes. I think they're dealing with earthquake damage, limited supplies, and now some kind of medical emergency. And I think the government doesn't want to acknowledge their existence because it would mean admitting their evacuation wasn't as complete as they claimed." "And the no-fly zone?" Captain Wright pulled up weather reports on his laptop. "The terrain is challenging, but I've flown in worse conditions. My guess is that the no-fly designation is more about controlling access than about safety." I stood there for a moment, processing what they were telling me. This was exactly the kind of situation where leadership meant making decisions with incomplete information and serious consequences. The wrong choice could risk my team's safety, violate international protocols, and potentially create diplomatic problems for the entire relief operation. The right choice could save lives. "How confident are you about the radio transmissions?" I asked Elena. "Very confident. I've been working with indigenous communities for 15 years. I know how they communicate, how they ask for help. These aren't false signals. I turned to Captain Wright. Realistically, could we get a helicopter into that valley? Carlos could do it. He's flown in terrain like this before, and he knows the local weather patterns. It would be risky, but manageable. The decision I was facing felt enormous. If I authorized an unauthorized flight into a government-designated no-fly zone to investigate an officially non-existent situation, I could be putting my entire team at risk. If Elena was wrong about the radio transmissions, or if the government was right about the dangers, I could end up responsible for a preventable tragedy. But if there really were people in Chejul dealing with earthquake damage and disease, and if we didn't act, those people could die while bureaucratic systems argued about whether they existed. I thought about all the times my family had suggested I wasn't ready for big decisions, that real leadership required the ability to make hard choices quickly. This was that moment. Here's what we're going to do, I said. Elena, I want you to continue monitoring those radio frequencies and try to establish direct communication with whoever is transmitting. Captain Wright, work with Carlos to plan a reconnaissance flight, minimal crew, maximum safety protocols. Dr. Hamilton needs to know about the potential disease outbreak so she can prepare appropriate medical supplies. What about authorization? Captain Wright asked. I'll handle that, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. Over the next 6 hours, our small team became a crisis response unit operating outside official channels. Elena managed to establish contact with someone in Chejul, a woman named Ixchel, who identified herself as a traditional healer and one of the community leaders who had remained behind. The conversation, conducted in Quiche with Elena translating, confirmed our worst fears. 43 people had stayed in or returned to Chejul after the official evacuation. They were living in partially damaged homes and improvised shelters, with limited food and no access to clean water. Worse, 12 people had become seriously ill over the past 5 days, and 3 had already died. The symptoms are consistent with cholera, Dr. Hamilton said after reviewing Elena's notes, probably caused by contaminated water sources damaged in the earthquake. If we don't get medical supplies and water purification equipment to them soon, we're looking at a significant number of deaths. And if infected people eventually make it to the refugee camps, Captain Wright added, we could have a major outbreak in a population that's already vulnerable. I spent an hour on the satellite phone with Dr. Chen, explaining the situation and requesting authorization for an emergency medical mission to Chejul. Sarah, she said finally, I understand the humanitarian urgency, but I can't authorize a mission that violates host government airspace restrictions. The diplomatic implications could compromise our entire operation in Guatemala. So we just let them die? We work through proper channels. I'll contact our embassy. They'll reach out to the National Emergency Commission, and hopefully we can get official authorization for a relief flight. How long will that take? There was a pause. Realistically, several days, maybe a week. After I hung up, I sat in my tent, staring at Elena's translated notes from Ixchel. 12 people sick, 3 dead, and symptoms that suggested the situation would get much worse very quickly. Several days of bureaucratic processes while people died from a preventable disease. This was the moment that would define whether I was actually a leader or just someone who followed other people's rules. That evening, I called an unofficial meeting with my core team, Elena, Captain Wright, Dr. Hamilton, and Miguel. We gathered around our camp stove as the sun set behind the mountains, and I laid out the situation honestly. We have a choice, I said. We can follow official protocols, wait for authorization that may or may not come, and hope that the people in Chejul survive long enough for bureaucracy to work. Or we can take action based on what we know is right. What are you proposing? Dr. Hamilton asked. An unauthorized medical mission. Minimal crew. Carlos, Elena for translation. Dr. Hamilton for medical assessment. Captain Wright for security and communications. We fly in, assess the situation, provide emergency medical supplies, and establish a communication link so the government can't ignore what's happening. The risks? Miguel asked. Captain Wright answered. Diplomatic repercussions, potential charges of violating airspace restrictions, possible end of our mission authorization, and of course the flight itself carries risks. The alternative? Elena said quietly, People die while we follow rules that prioritize politics over lives. Dr. Hamilton was nodding slowly. I've got enough medical supplies to treat cholera, and I can bring water purification tablets. If we can get there quickly, we can probably save most of the people who are sick. I looked around at my team, these experienced professionals who had chosen to follow someone who, according to fellowship committees and family dinners, lacked the qualifications for real leadership. I need to be clear about what I'm asking, I said. This isn't a group decision, this is my call, and I'm taking full responsibility for the consequences. If anyone wants to opt out, there won't be any judgment. No one moved. When do we leave? Captain Wright asked. Dawn, I said. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the canvas ceiling of my tent, knowing that in a few hours I would either prove that my instincts about leadership were right, or I would end my career in spectacular fashion. But for the first time since that family dinner 2 months ago, I felt absolutely certain that I was making the right choice. Because real leadership wasn't about following rules, or impressing committees, or managing budgets that looked good on paper. Real leadership was about human beings in impossible situations, and the willingness to risk everything to do what was right. At 5 a.m., Carlos started the helicopter engines, and we lifted off into the dawn sky, heading toward a village that officially didn't exist to help people that the world had forgotten. It was the most important decision I'd ever made. The flight to Chajul was the longest 45 minutes of my life. Carlos navigated through mountain passes that seemed barely wide enough for the helicopter's rotor span, while fog rolled up from the valleys below and obscured our view of the terrain. Dr. Hamilton sat across from me, checking and rechecking her medical supplies, while Elena monitored radio frequencies and Captain Wright coordinated with our base camp. Approaching the valley now, Carlos announced through our headsets. Weather's marginal, but I can get us down. As we descended through the cloud cover, Chajul appeared below us like something from a nightmare. The earthquake had split the valley floor with massive fissures, and what had once been a village of several hundred people was now a collection of partially collapsed buildings and improvised shelters clustered around a damaged church. The river that had provided the community's water supply was choked with debris and landslide runoff, clearly the source of the contamination that was killing people. But what struck me most was the people themselves. As soon as they heard the helicopter, figures emerged from shelters and damaged buildings, waving frantically and pointing toward a cleared area that could serve as a landing zone. These weren't people who had chosen to ignore government evacuation orders out of stubbornness. These were people who had been abandoned by systems that were supposed to protect them. There, Elena said, pointing to a woman standing near what appeared to be a makeshift clinic. That must be Ixchel. Carlos set us down in a cloud of dust and debris, and as soon as the rotors stopped spinning, we were surrounded by people who had been waiting days for help that they weren't sure would ever come. Ixchel approached first, an elderly woman wearing traditional clothing and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had become responsible for her community's survival. She spoke rapidly to Elena in Quiche, gesturing toward the improvised clinic and then toward the damaged church where I could see people lying on mats spread across the floor. She says 12 people are sick, but it's getting worse, Elena translated. 3 more developed symptoms yesterday. She's been trying to treat them with traditional remedies, but she knows it's not enough. Dr. Hamilton was already moving toward the clinic, her medical bag in hand. Where are the sickest patients? What followed was a medical assessment that confirmed our worst fears. The cholera outbreak was spreading rapidly through the community, and without immediate intervention, we were looking at a mortality rate that could devastate the remaining population. I need to start IV fluids immediately, Dr. Hamilton told me after examining the most critical patients. These 3 people are severely dehydrated and won't survive another day without aggressive treatment. While Dr. Hamilton worked to stabilize the sickest patients, I walked through the settlement with Ixchel and Elena, trying to understand why these people had remained behind when everyone else had evacuated. The answer was both simple and heartbreaking. Many of the people in Chajul were elderly or disabled, individuals who couldn't easily make the difficult journey to evacuation centers. Others had returned within days of the earthquake to try to salvage belongings or livestock that represented their life's work. When they found the access road completely impassable, they'd become trapped, unable to leave, but also unable to get word to the outside world about their situation. She says the government teams told them the road would be cleared within a week, Elena translated as Ixchel pointed toward the landslide-blocked pass. That was 3 weeks ago. Captain Wright had set up our communications equipment and was documenting everything: the medical situation, the infrastructure damage, the number of people requiring assistance. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was an evidence-gathering operation that would prove the government's evacuation claims had been dangerously incomplete. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Hamilton had stabilized the most critical patients and begun treating others with oral rehydration therapy and antibiotics. But the larger problem remained. The community's water supply was contaminated, their food stores were running low, and they had no way to communicate with the outside world if the situation deteriorated. "We need to establish a permanent communication link," I told Captain Wright, "something that will allow them to call for help if there are more medical emergencies." "I can set up a radio relay," he said, "but it will require someone here who knows how to operate the equipment." That's when Ixa surprised us. Through Elena, she explained that her grandson had served in the Guatemalan military and was familiar with radio communications. He'd been one of the people who had returned to help his grandmother and other elderly community members after the official evacuation. Miguel, a young man in his 20s who had lost his left arm in the earthquake but retained his technical skills, proved to be a quick learner with the radio equipment. Within an hour, Captain Wright had trained him to maintain communication with our base camp and, if necessary, with emergency services in Guatemala City. But our biggest challenge was still ahead of us. As we prepared to load our helicopter with the 3 most critically ill patients for emergency evacuation, Carlos received a radio transmission that made my blood run cold. "Unidentified aircraft in the Chajul Valley. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Land immediately and prepare for inspection by National Emergency Commission officials." A military helicopter was approaching from the south, and we had about 10 minutes before it arrived. "What do you want to do?" Carlos asked, his voice tight with tension. I looked around at what we'd accomplished in 6 hours. 3 people who would have died were now stable enough for transport. The community had medical supplies and water purification tablets that would prevent new cases of cholera. We'd established communications that would ensure this community couldn't be ignored again. But we'd also violated government airspace restrictions, conducted an unauthorized medical mission, and were about to be confronted by officials who weren't going to be happy about any of it. "We complete the mission," I said, "load the patients, finish the medical supply distribution, and document everything." When the military helicopter landed, 3 officials in government uniforms approached our group with the kind of official displeasure that meant serious consequences were coming. The lead official, a man who introduced himself as Colonel Martinez from the National Emergency Commission, demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. "I'm Sarah Morrison, State Department Advanced Team Leader," I said, stepping forward. "I authorized this medical mission in response to a humanitarian emergency." "Ms. Morrison, you are in violation of restricted airspace and government evacuation protocols," Colonel Martinez said, his English precise but accented with anger. "This area was evacuated 3 weeks ago for public safety reasons." "Colonel, with respect, this area clearly wasn't evacuated," I replied, gesturing toward the 43 people who were standing around us. "These people have been living here without assistance for 3 weeks, and they're dealing with a cholera outbreak that has already killed 3 people. These individuals returned to an unsafe area against government orders," he said. "They were properly evacuated and chose to disregard official instructions." Elena stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Spanish with Colonel Martinez. I couldn't follow the entire conversation, but I caught enough to understand that she was explaining the situation from the community's perspective: the elderly and disabled people who hadn't been able to evacuate, the blocked roads that prevented them from leaving even if they wanted to. Ixchel joined the conversation, speaking in a mixture of Spanish and Quiche, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through decades of government promises and failures. Finally, Dr. Hamilton approached with her medical documentation. "Colonel, regardless of how these people came to be here, they're currently experiencing a cholera outbreak that poses a public health risk. The 3 patients we're evacuating need immediate hospital treatment, and the community needs continued medical support to prevent additional deaths." Colonel Martinez reviewed Dr. Hamilton's medical reports, spoke quietly with his colleagues, and then made a decision that probably saved my career. Ms. Morrison, your mission was unauthorized and violated government protocols. However, the medical emergency you've documented represents a legitimate humanitarian crisis that requires continued intervention. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. The National Emergency Commission will be taking over responsibility for this community's needs, and your team will coordinate future assistance through proper channels. Is that understood? Understood, I said, though I suspected this was as much about the colonel covering for his government's incomplete evacuation as it was about following proper protocols. We completed the patient evacuation under official oversight, and Colonel Martinez's team took responsibility for coordinating ongoing medical support for Chujul. But as we flew back to our base camp, I knew that everything had changed. Captain Wright handed me a satellite phone. Dr. Chen wants to speak with you. The conversation was brief and to the point. Sarah, I'm getting reports about an unauthorized mission in restricted airspace. Please tell me you have a very good explanation. We documented and responded to a cholera outbreak in a community that wasn't properly evacuated, I said. We saved lives and established protocols to prevent the spread of disease to refugee populations. There was a long pause. How many lives? At least 12 people who would have died from cholera, possibly dozens more if the outbreak had spread to the refugee camps. Another pause. Sarah, what you did was reckless, unauthorized, and could have created a diplomatic incident. My heart sank. I understand. It was also exactly what a leader should do when faced with an impossible situation, she continued. Colonel Martinez has filed a report commending your team's medical intervention and recommending continued coordination. The Guatemalan government is calling it a successful joint operation. I felt dizzy with relief. But, Dr. Chen continued, we need to talk about your future. Actions like this one tend to get attention, and not all of it is the kind you can control. She was right. Within 48 hours, news of the Chujul rescue had spread beyond official channels. Dr. Hamilton had documented everything, Captain Wright had filed detailed reports, and Elena had made sure that Ixchel's story reached indigenous rights organizations throughout Central America. The story that emerged wasn't just about a successful medical mission, it was about a forgotten community, an incomplete government evacuation, and a group of humanitarian workers who had chosen to act when systems failed. And somehow, I had become the leader of that story. For the first time in my life, I was about to discover what it felt like when the world was watching. The first sign that our Chujul mission had become something bigger than a routine humanitarian operation came 3 days later, when Elena burst into my tent holding her laptop and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, something between excitement and terror. Sarah, you need to see this, she said, setting the computer on my field desk. We're trending. On her screen was a Twitter post with over 50,000 retweets. It was a photo Captain Wright had taken of Dr. Hamilton treating one of the cholera patients in the improvised clinic, with Ixchel assisting and me visible in the background coordinating the supply distribution. The caption read, "While government officials claimed this village was evacuated, these humanitarian workers risked everything to save lives. This is what real leadership looks like. Hashtag Chujul Rescue. Hashtag Humanitarian Heroes." Who posted this? I asked, scrolling through hundreds of comments in multiple languages. Miguel, Elena said, Ixchel's grandson. Remember we set up that radio communication system? Well, he also managed to get internet access through a satellite connection, and he's been documenting everything. The story has been picked up by indigenous rights organizations, humanitarian groups, and now mainstream media. My satellite phone rang before I could fully process what Elena was showing me. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen's number. Sarah, are you seeing the news coverage? She asked without preamble. Just starting to, I said, still staring at Elena's laptop screen. CNN International wants to interview you. So does the BBC. The Washington Post is running a front-page story tomorrow about the Chujul rescue, and they're calling it an example of humanitarian leadership that succeeded where government systems failed. I felt that familiar sensation of the world moving faster than I could process. Dr. Chen, I just did my job. My team did their jobs. We responded to a medical emergency. Sarah, you led an unauthorized mission into restricted airspace to save lives that your own government told you didn't exist. In the current political climate, that's either the kind of story that makes careers or destroys them, and right now, it's making yours. Over the next week, as our earthquake relief operation continued, I found myself fielding interview requests from journalists around the world. The story had captured attention because it contained elements that resonated across political and cultural boundaries. A forgotten community, a cover-up by officials, a group of aid workers who chose human life over bureaucratic rules, and a woman leader who had made decisions based on moral conviction rather than career advancement. But the interview that changed everything came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing supply distribution reports when Elena approached with another journalist request. There's a reporter from 60 Minutes who wants to do a longer piece about humanitarian leadership in crisis situations. She specifically asked to interview you, and she wants to bring a camera crew to Chajul to document the community's recovery. What's her angle? I asked, having learned to be cautious about media attention. Her name is Rebecca Walsh, and she's done investigative pieces on international aid effectiveness. She says she's interested in documenting what she calls authentic leadership, people who lead through action rather than authority. The interview took place at our base camp 2 days later, with the mountains of Guatemala providing a dramatic backdrop. Rebecca Walsh turned out to be a sharp, experienced journalist who had covered humanitarian crises around the world, and her questions pushed me to articulate things about leadership that I'd never really examined before. You've been described as leading one of the most effective disaster response operations in recent memory, she said as cameras rolled. But according to your background, you've never managed a budget larger than a few $100,000, never supervised more than a dozen people, never worked internationally before this mission. How do you explain your success? It was exactly the kind of question my family would have asked, the implicit suggestion that my qualifications didn't match my results. I think there's a difference between managing systems and leading people, I said, surprised by how clear my thoughts felt under the pressure of being filmed. My background working with veterans taught me that leadership often happens in crisis moments when people need someone to make decisions based on human need, rather than organizational charts. Can you give me an example? I thought about Rosa and the medical examination of her daughter, about the coordination meeting with multiple NGOs, about the decision to fly to Chajul despite government restrictions. Every major decision we've made on this mission has come down to choosing between following rules and helping people, I said. Real leadership, at least in humanitarian work, means being willing to take responsibility for those choices, even when the outcomes are uncertain. Rebecca Walsh leaned forward. Some critics have suggested that your Chajul mission was reckless, that you put your team at risk and violated government sovereignty. How do you respond to that? I respond by pointing to the results, I said. 12 people who would have died from cholera are alive. A community that had been forgotten by official systems now has medical support, clean water, and communication with the outside world. My team operated safely and professionally under dangerous conditions. If that's reckless, then I'm comfortable being called reckless. The interview aired 3 weeks later, and the response was unlike anything I could have anticipated. The segment, titled "The Leader Nobody Expected," portrayed me as an example of what the network called crisis leadership, the ability to make effective decisions under extreme pressure without traditional authority structures. But more than the media coverage, what really mattered was the response from people who were doing similar work around the world. I started receiving messages from humanitarian workers, disaster response specialists, and development professionals who said the story had articulated something they'd experienced but never been able to express, the idea that real leadership often happened outside official recognition systems. The message that affected me most came from Colonel Patricia Hayes, my former commanding officer who had recommended me for the Guatemala mission. Morrison, her email read, I've been following the coverage of your work in Guatemala, and I wanted you to know that watching you lead this operation has been one of the most satisfying experiences of my military career. You've proven that the leadership qualities I saw in you years ago were exactly what the world needed, even if it took a crisis to bring them out. You've made all of us who believed in you look very smart. But the real test came when Dr. Chen called with news that would change the entire trajectory of my career. Sarah, I have an offer for you, but I need you to sit down before I explain it. I was already sitting in my tent, but her tone made me brace for something significant. The success of the Guatemala operation has caught attention at the highest levels of the State Department. They want to create a new position, Director of Crisis Response Leadership, specifically designed around the kind of work you've been doing. You'd lead a team that responds to complex humanitarian emergencies, where traditional aid structures aren't sufficient. The position she described was everything I'd never imagined possible. A permanent role leading international humanitarian operations, with resources to assemble specialized teams for different types of crises, and the authority to make decisions without waiting for layers of bureaucratic approval. It would be based in Washington, but you'd spend most of your time in the field, Dr. Chen continued. The mandate would be to develop new models for humanitarian leadership that can operate effectively in situations where government systems have failed or are inadequate. What's the catch? I asked, because opportunities like this always came with complications. The catch is that this position will be high profile and politically sensitive. Every decision you make will be scrutinized by media, criticized by people who think humanitarian work should follow traditional channels, and second-guessed by officials who prefer systems over results. You'll be successful, but you'll also be controversial. I thought about the fellowship rejection that had seemed so devastating just a few months earlier, about my family's certainty that I lacked the qualifications for real leadership, about all the times I'd been told that my approach to helping people was too small-scale to matter. Dr. Chen, are you sure they want me for this position? I'm still the same person who was rejected from the International Development Leadership Fellowship 6 months ago. She laughed, the first time I'd heard her sound genuinely amused during our entire working relationship. Sarah, the fellowship committee that rejected you has been disbanded. 3 of its members have called me personally to ask if there's any way they can reverse their decision. You've demonstrated in the field what they were trying to identify through applications and interviews. They got it wrong, and now everyone knows it. That night, I walked through our base camp one final time before making my decision. The earthquake relief operation was winding down, communities were rebuilding, and my team was preparing to return to their regular assignments. The work we'd done here would continue without us, managed by local organizations and government agencies that had learned to coordinate more effectively. I thought about Miguel in Chajul, still operating the radio system that kept his community connected to the outside world. I thought about Rosa's daughter, who had recovered from her internal injuries and was back in school. I thought about the coordination systems we'd established that had prevented the cholera outbreak from spreading to refugee camps. Most of all, I thought about Elena's words from that first week. You solved that problem by creating collaboration. Maybe that was what leadership actually meant. Not commanding respect or managing large budgets or impressing selection committees, but creating conditions where people could work together to solve problems that mattered. The next morning, I called Dr. Chen and accepted the position. I had no idea that within 48 hours my family would be reading about my promotion in the Washington Post, or that they would be calling me for the first time since that dinner where they'd written me out of their will. The conversation with my parents was going to be very different this time. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I'd returned from Guatemala. I was in my new office at the State Department in Washington, reviewing briefing materials for my first assignment as Director of Crisis Response Leadership, a flooding crisis in Bangladesh that would require the same kind of multi-stakeholder coordination we'd developed in Guatemala. The caller ID showed my parents' home number, which was unusual enough to make me pause. In the 8 months since our dinner conversation about the will, we'd exchanged maybe a dozen text messages and one awkward phone call on my birthday. Certainly nothing that would prompt a 7 a.m. call on a weekday. Sarah? My mother's voice sounded different, less composed than usual, with an undertone I couldn't immediately identify. I hope I'm not calling too early. I know you're busy with your new position. The way she said new position told me everything I needed to know about why she was calling. It's fine, Mom. What's going on? Well, your father and we've been reading about your work in Guatemala, the articles, the interviews. We saw the piece on 60 Minutes. Of course they had. The media coverage had been extensive enough that it would have been impossible for them to avoid, especially since several articles had mentioned my background and family connections. The Washington Post profile had even included a photo of me from my college graduation, standing between my parents in their formal attire. "That's nice," I said, not sure what response she was looking for. "Sarah, we had no idea about the scope of what you've been doing. The lives you've saved, the leadership you've shown. We're very proud of you." The words hit me with unexpected force. I'd imagined this conversation dozens of times over the past few months, but I'd never anticipated how it would actually feel to hear my mother express pride in work that she'd previously dismissed as small-scale and insignificant. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "We were wondering if you might be free for dinner this weekend. Your father and I would like to talk with you about several things. Victoria and Bradley will be there too. It would mean a lot if you could come." I stared out the window of my office at the morning traffic on Constitution Avenue, trying to process what felt like a complete reversal of our family dynamics. 6 months ago, they'd written me out of their will because I lacked leadership potential. Now they were inviting me to a family dinner to discuss my newfound success. "I'll need to check my schedule," I said, though I already knew I was free. "Can I get back to you?" "Of course, sweetheart. Just, please consider it. We have some things we'd like to discuss with you." After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about how dramatically things had changed. The fellowship rejection that had felt so devastating was now a footnote in news articles about my, quote, unconventional path to humanitarian leadership. The family dinner where I'd been dismissed as a follower was now being reframed as a misunderstanding that my parents wanted to correct. But what bothered me most was that my feelings about their recognition weren't as straightforward as I'd expected them to be. I called Elena, who was back in Guatemala working on a follow-up project in the communities we'd served. "They want to have a family dinner to celebrate my success," I told her after explaining the call from my mother. "And you're not sure how you feel about that?" "I'm not sure why I should care what they think now. Their opinion of my work didn't matter when I was in Guatemala making decisions that saved lives. Why should it matter now that CNN thinks those decisions were newsworthy?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "Because family relationships are complicated. And because part of you probably still wants their approval even though you don't need it anymore." She was right, of course. Despite everything that had happened, despite the professional recognition and the career advancement, there was still a part of me that wanted my parents to understand that the work I'd been doing all along had been meaningful and important. I agreed to the dinner. The drive to Greenwich the following Saturday felt different than it had 8 months earlier. I was no longer the disappointment daughter coming home to face questions about my limited career prospects. I was a senior State Department official who had been profiled in major newspapers and interviewed on national television. My work was being studied by humanitarian organizations around the world as a model for crisis leadership. But as I pulled into the familiar driveway, I realized that the house looked exactly the same, and so did the family dynamics I was walking into. Victoria's Tesla was already there, along with a black BMW I didn't recognize, probably Bradley's new car, purchased with his latest bonus from the private equity firm. The house still radiated the same impression of success and stability, the same careful curation of wealth and achievement. My mother met me at the door wearing a smile that seemed more genuine than the ones I remembered from previous visits. "Sarah, you look wonderful. The television interviews don't do you justice." I followed her into the living room, where my father and Victoria were already seated with cocktails. The conversation stopped abruptly when I entered, and I could feel them taking in my appearance, looking for signs of how my newfound prominence had changed me. "Sarah," my father said, standing to shake my hand with more warmth than he'd shown me in years. "Congratulations on the promotion. Director of Crisis Response Leadership. That's quite an achievement." "Thank you," I said, accepting a glass of wine and settling into the chair I'd occupied during countless family gatherings. Victoria was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I have to admit, I never would have predicted this outcome when we last talked. The State Department position, the media attention, the international recognition. It's impressive. There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with this reversal of our family roles. For our entire lives, she had been the successful daughter, the one who impressed our parents with corporate achievements and strategic career moves. Now, suddenly, I was the one being featured in major newspapers and invited to speak at international conferences. "It's been an interesting few months," I said, trying to navigate the conversation without seeming either too modest or too proud. Dinner conversation was unlike anything I'd experienced with my family before. Instead of the usual focus on Victoria's latest promotion or my parents' social commitments, the questions were all directed at me. They wanted to know about my work in Guatemala, about the decision-making process during the Chajul rescue, about my plans for the new State Department position. But what struck me most was that they were asking about the same kind of work I'd been doing for years, just on a larger scale and with more media attention. "When you decided to fly to that village against government orders," my father said as we moved to dessert, "that must have been an enormous risk. How did you know it was the right decision?" "I didn't know," I said honestly. "I knew that people were dying, that we had the capability to help them, and that waiting for official authorization might mean arriving too late to save lives. The rest was just accepting responsibility for the consequences of that decision." "But that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that real leaders have to do," my mother said. "Making difficult decisions with incomplete information, managing complex stakeholder relationships, taking responsibility for outcomes that affect hundreds of people." I almost laughed at the irony. She was describing my work at the VA, the same work she'd dismissed as small-scale counseling services during our last family dinner. "Mom," I said gently, "that's the same kind of decision-making I've been doing for years working with veterans." The scale was different, but the leadership challenges were essentially the same. There was an uncomfortable pause as the implications of what I'd said settled around the table. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Sarah, that's actually something we wanted to discuss with you. We realized that we may have underestimated the significance of your work. The leadership qualities you've demonstrated internationally were probably evident in your veteran services work as well." "Probably," I agreed, keeping my voice neutral. Victoria set down her wine glass. "I think what Dad's trying to say is that we didn't recognize leadership when it didn't look like what we expected leadership to look like." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from my family, and it was probably as much acknowledgement as I needed. "We've been discussing your inheritance situation," my mother said, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. "Given your new position and the recognition you've received, we think it's appropriate to revisit our estate planning decisions. We'd like to restructure the will to reflect a more equitable distribution," my father added. "The house, the investments, the family assets, we think they should be split equally between you and Victoria." I looked around the dining room where this conversation was taking place, at the family photos that now included several images of me receiving awards or being interviewed by journalists. 6 months ago, this house had represented everything I'd never be able to achieve. Now it was being offered to me as recognition of achievements I'd already surpassed. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure that's necessary." The surprise on their faces was evident. They'd clearly expected me to be grateful for the restoration of my inheritance, the acknowledgement that I deserved equal treatment with Victoria. "What do you mean?" Victoria asked. "I mean that your opinion of my inheritance worthiness seems to be based on external recognition, rather than the actual work I've been doing. 8 months ago, you thought I lacked leadership potential because my work wasn't visible enough to impress you. Now you want to change your estate planning because CNN thinks my work is impressive." The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed that I'd identified exactly what was happening. "The work hasn't changed," I continued. "The values that guided my decisions in Guatemala are the same values that guided my work with veterans. The leadership abilities you're now acknowledging were the same abilities I was using when you decided I wasn't qualified for equal treatment." My father shifted in his chair. "Sarah, we made a mistake. We're trying to correct it." "I know," I said, "and I appreciate that you're acknowledging the mistake. But I don't need the inheritance to validate my work, and I don't need the inheritance to prove that I'm successful." I paused, looking at each of them in turn. What I needed was for you to see that the work I was already doing mattered, not because it impressed other people, but because it made a difference in people's lives. That recognition would have meant something 6 months ago. Now, honestly, your opinion of my success isn't something I need anymore. Victoria leaned forward. "So you're refusing the inheritance?" I'm saying that whether or not you include me in your will should be based on your actual relationship with me, not on how my career looks in newspaper articles. If you want to restore my inheritance because you value me as your daughter, that's one thing. If you want to restore it because I've become successful enough to deserve equal treatment with Victoria, that's something else entirely. The conversation continued for another hour, but the fundamental dynamic had been established. My parents wanted to celebrate my success and restore my status within the family, but they still didn't understand that my worth as their daughter, and my qualifications as a leader, had never been dependent on external recognition. As I drove back to Washington that night, I realized that the most important thing about the evening wasn't what my family had said, but how I'd felt during the conversation. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval to know that my work mattered. And that freedom felt better than any inheritance could have. 6 months later, I was standing on a stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of 2,000 humanitarian workers, government officials, and international development leaders who had gathered for the Global Crisis Leadership Summit. The event was built around the success of our Guatemala operation and the new crisis response models we'd developed in Bangladesh, Somalia, and most recently, after Hurricane Maria devastated remote communities in Puerto Rico. But what made this moment surreal wasn't the prestigious venue or the international audience. It was seeing my family in the third row, sitting together and listening as the moderator introduced me as one of the most innovative humanitarian leaders of our generation. Dr. Morrison, the moderator said, using the honorary doctorate I'd received from Georgetown University the previous month, your approach to crisis leadership has been called revolutionary by some, controversial by others. How do you respond to critics who say that your methods prioritize individual relationships over systematic change? I'd been asked variations of this question dozens of times over the past year, and my answer had evolved as I'd gained confidence in articulating what I'd learned through experience. I think that's a false dichotomy, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. The most effective systematic changes happen when they're built on understanding individual human needs. The programs we've developed, whether in Guatemala, Bangladesh, or Puerto Rico, work because they start with listening to people who are experiencing crisis, rather than imposing solutions designed by people who aren't. Can you give us a specific example? I thought about Miguel in Chajul, still operating the communication system that had become a model for connecting isolated communities during disasters. I thought about Rashida in Bangladesh, who had trained other women to be flood response coordinators in their villages. I thought about Carmen in Puerto Rico, whose community had developed an early warning system that had prevented casualties during the last hurricane season. In every operation we've led, the breakthrough moments have come when we stopped trying to manage people and started trying to enable them, I said. Real leadership in crisis situations means creating conditions where communities can solve their own problems, rather than becoming dependent on outside assistance. After the panel discussion, there was a reception where I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss job opportunities, funding partnerships, and speaking engagements. It was the kind of professional networking event that would have intimidated me a year ago but now felt like a natural extension of the work I was doing. That's when I saw Victoria approaching through the crowd, looking elegant in a black cocktail dress but also somehow diminished in a way I couldn't quite identify. "Sarah," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth, "that was an incredible presentation. I had no idea you were such a compelling public speaker." "Thanks," I said. "I'm surprised you all came. It's not exactly your usual social scene." Victoria glanced around at the humanitarian workers and development specialists who filled the room. "No, it's not. But after seeing the coverage of your work, we realized we wanted to understand what you've been building." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation at dinner 6 months ago, about leadership looking different than what we expected. And I think you were right that we didn't recognize what we were seeing, but I also think there's something else we missed." I waited for her to continue. "We measured leadership by titles and budgets and recognition because those were the metrics we understood. But watching you tonight, seeing how people respond to you, hearing how you talk about your work, I'm starting to realize that we weren't just wrong about your capabilities. We were wrong about what leadership actually means. It was a more honest conversation than Victoria and I had had in years, and I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge what had taken me months to understand myself. I spent so much time trying to prove I could lead the way you and Dad lead, I said. It took a crisis in Guatemala for me to realize that the most effective leadership often looks completely different from what we expect. Are you happy? Victoria asked, and the question surprised me with its directness. I looked around the reception, at the colleagues who had become friends, at the work that had become a mission, at the life I'd built around values that actually mattered to me. Yes, I said, I'm happy in a way I didn't know was possible. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and most of the attendees had dispersed, I found myself walking along the Potomac River with my parents. The Kennedy Center was lit up behind us, and the Washington Monument reflected off the water as we talked about things we'd never discussed before. I owe you an apology, my father said as we stopped at a bench overlooking the river, not just for the inheritance decision, but for failing to see what you were capable of. Dad, we've been through this. No, he interrupted, let me finish. I've spent my career in law, where success is measured by cases won, fees collected, partnerships achieved. Your mother built her reputation through social connections and charitable board positions. Victoria succeeded in corporate environments where performance is quantified and ranked. He looked out at the water. We understood those kinds of success because they were familiar. But what you've accomplished, building trust with traumatized communities, coordinating complex operations under impossible conditions, making decisions that save lives, that requires a kind of leadership we'd never encountered before. What I'm trying to say, my mother added, is that we didn't just underestimate you. We didn't understand that the kind of work you were doing was actually more difficult and more important than what the rest of us had achieved. It was the acknowledgement I'd needed to hear, not 6 months ago when I was still seeking their approval, but now when I could receive it without needing it to validate my choices. I appreciate that, I said, and I understand why it was hard to recognize. The leadership skills I developed working with veterans weren't visible in the ways you were used to measuring success. Will you consider restoring your place in the will, my father asked, not because you've become successful in ways we recognize, but because we want to repair the damage we caused by making you feel like you weren't valued as our daughter. I thought about the question for a long time, watching the lights of passing boats on the river. I'll consider it, I said finally, but I want you to understand that my relationship with you can't be contingent on your opinion of my career, positive or negative. If we're going to rebuild our family connection, it has to be based on who we are to each other, not on how impressive my work looks to outside observers. 3 weeks later, I was back in Guatemala, visiting the communities where our crisis response work had begun. The earthquake damage had been repaired, new buildings had been constructed to better building standards, and the coordination systems we'd established had become permanent features of the region's emergency preparedness. But the visit that mattered most was to Chajul, where Miguel still maintained the communication system that had become a model for other isolated communities throughout Central America. Miss Sarah, he said, embracing me like the old friend he'd become, you should see what we've built. The village had been transformed. The cholera outbreak was now a memory, replaced by a clean water system and health clinic that served not just Chajul, but several neighboring communities. More importantly, the leadership structures that had emerged during the crisis had evolved into a local development council that was planning education and economic programs for the entire valley. You taught us that we didn't need permission to solve our own problems, Ixchel told me through Elena's translation as we sat in the rebuilt community center. Now we teach other communities the same thing. That evening, as I sat by the river that had once been contaminated and was now running clear, I reflected on everything that had changed since that family dinner 18 months earlier. My parents had been wrong about my leadership potential, but they'd also been wrong about what leadership actually meant. Real leadership wasn't about commanding respect, or managing large budgets, or impressing selection committees. It was about creating conditions where people could access their own strength, solve their own problems, and build their own futures. I'd spent years trying to prove I could lead the way they expected leaders to lead, when what the world actually needed was for me to lead the way only I could lead. The next morning, I flew back to Washington to begin planning our next operation, a complex refugee crisis in Syria that would require everything I'd learned about building trust, coordinating resources, and making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. But as the plane lifted off from Guatemala City, I wasn't thinking about the challenges ahead or the recognition behind me. I was thinking about Miguel and Ixchel and all the other people who had taught me that leadership wasn't something you achieved, it was something you practiced, one relationship at a time, one crisis at a time, one decision at a time. They'd said I'd never lead anyone. They were wrong. But more importantly, I discovered that their definition of leadership had been wrong too. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.